Kia ora koutou katoa. The liturgical ritual called the Peace makes a simple yet deep theological statement. I see God in you. Not because you're good, great, wonderful, and accomplished. You might or might not be any or all of those. But because you are a person. And in all persons there is a mysterious depth and potency, the glimmer of possibility, the gift of being. It's akin to the word namaste, the greeting in Sanskrit, which means the light divinity in me greets the light, the divinity in you. And there's a second simple, yet deep theological statement in this, the peace ritual, which says, you, like me, belong. In the language of St. Paul, Christ, the reconciling arms of God, has broken down all the barriers that divide people from each other. Everyone belongs. Belonging is a given. There are no preconditions to belonging, no creeds to believe, membership forms to fill, no morality or behavior checks. Whether you're good, bad, grumpy, or grateful, you belong. For belonging is not reliant on us. We simply give voice, give substance to it by our words and actions. Some of the practicalities of the peace ritual. Usually we greet just those around us as representative of all those in the building. In greeting a few, we are symbolizing that we are greeting all. So we're including not just those we know and those we don't, but even those we find difficult. We are symbolizing that inclusive belonging. The peace can be a time to welcome visitors and newcomers, but it's important for people who are visiting or who find groups of people unsettling to only participate in the ritual to the extent they want to. It's also important to respect the degree of physical touch and proximity that each person considers it appropriate. If unsure, ask. The peace is often used as a ritual prior to communion to emphasize belonging and the invitation for all to participate if they so wish. The peace is also rightly named, for it holds before us both the bedrock of and the vision for peace. Different from each other, we can come together. Delighting or discordant with each other, we can come together. Diverse and divergent we may be, but the more fundamental truth, the bedrock, is that we're all braced, recognized, and welcome in God, the heart of God, of which our service is trying to reflect. Today is the closest Sunday to St. Andrew's Day, November the 30th. If you don't want to trip over Advent, which is December the 1st, and don't mind skipping liturgies like Stir Up Sunday, which is a wonderful reminder of the importance of Christmas pudding, and Christ the King Sunday, which is a terrible reminder of how the Constantinian Church weaponized Jesus, and the placard bearers of God, Guns and Trump still do. These liturgies skipped today are customary for the Sunday before Advent. The foremost theme of St. Andrew's Day, and here Scotland and Robbie Burns take a back seat, is befriending. Befriending the neighbour, the outsider, the other, the child. And also befriending yourself, the good and the not so good of you, the whole you, the fragile and fabulous you. And also befriending God, God encountered and to be befriended in neighbour and self, whatever that word God actually refers to. Yet I want to begin by, where I left off in talking about the peace, that introductory ritual of saying, I see God in you and you, like me, belong, which is a statement of faith, probably the most important one, which in turn leads me to the question of, what are we doing here when we gather for an hour or more on a Sunday morning? Our church-going ancestors, or at least their ministers, would have been clear. You are here to praise and thank God, confess your wrongdoings, petition God for those in need, and hear God's words spoken from the Bible and pulpit. All of which is premised on a paradigm that many of us find wanting. Probably some of our ancestors did too, but wisely kept their mouths shut. Yet if you understand God not to be a being, supreme or otherwise, but that which gives rise to all being, a ground, a water in which we fish swim. Let me stop there. Tell you a story, a little Mello story. Once upon a time there was a little fish who was searching for this wonderful thing called the ocean, which was meant to be vast and beautiful and full of adventure. And the little fish kept searching and searching, but to no avail. She became increasingly frustrated because she couldn't find the ocean anywhere she looked. The little fish finally mustered up enough courage to approach an older fish to ask for help. "Excuse me," said the little fish. "You are older than I, so you can tell me where to find this thing called the ocean." "Why, little fish," said the older fish, "the ocean is where you and I are and what you are swimming in right now. It is all around you." "Ah, no," said the little fish, who was deeply disappointed. "This is water. There's nothing special about water. What I'm looking for is the ocean." So the little fish swam away to search elsewhere. To expand on this story's world, most little fish, or at least those in the Christian school, are told God is the biggest fish in the ocean. Although I've never seen him, and it's usually a him. And for many of us gathered here at St. Luke's, maybe the older we get, this depiction of God becomes too unlikely and too limiting. But in Mello's parable, and interpreters can too quickly equate water with God. I think the ocean is more akin to the spiritual quest or spiritual meaning, and the quest is about looking, paying attention, noticing the wonder we swim in, and ingest it and marvel at it. So if you understand God not to be a supreme being, the biggest fish, to not be living primarily far, far away, not apart from us, but a part of us, closer than our very breath, to quote Eckhart, then that old minister about things about praising and thanking and confessing and petitioning, well, they take on a different hue and maybe are inadequate to describe what's going on here. And if you understand the Bible, doctrines and sermons, rather than accurately descriptive, prescriptive, proscriptive, to be more about story, poetry, theopoetics, shuffled up with history, culture, myths and politics and their prejudices. To be at best signposts, pointers to where to explore and doubts to wrestle with, than hearing God's words spoken. It's also an inadequate, if not erroneous, description of what is going on here. Our first reading today, courtesy of the philosopher John Caputo, who gifted us that word theopoetics, reminds us of what we instinctively know, that a simple word, gesture or object, in this case a shabby old hat, can evoke and can bring the past and present, even the future, together as we encounter a depth of meaning, a whole world of love. And he points to poets like Coleridge, whereas I would point to Mary Oliver, who was also in that poetic, prophetic stream of understanding the big things in life by noticing the little things in life. Noticing, paying attention, looking. That's how Oliver and Caputo imagine what we're doing in prayer. So the words we say, sing and read on a Sunday morning can serve as shabby old hats. In other words, sparks to the fire of our imagination, memories and hopes. Sometimes those words are in the form of a story, or set to a tune, or juxtaposed in a way that surprises and delights us, and do the job of eliciting in us that encounter with a depth of meaning. But that's only a part of what's going on here, for that depth referred to is not just something cerebral. And here the word awareness I find more helpful. Together, and liturgy is always about togetherness, we are acknowledging, wondering, and giving thanks that we are part of the world, not apart from the world, that we are woven into the fabric of the universe. Barbara Brown Taylor uses the word God to talk about this togetherness when she writes, God is all over the place. God is up there, down here, inside my skin and out. God is the web, the energy, the space, the light, not captured in them as if those concepts were more real than what unites them, but revealed in that singular, vast net of relationships that animates everything there is. Everyone is related. Everything is connected. A singular, vast net of relationships that animates everything. The depth, to return to Caputo and now St. Paul, or maybe St. Paul, is that in which we live and move and have our being. That is God beyond God, as Tillich would say. That is God beyond our constructions of God. And we all need constructions of God. And we all need to know that in time those constructions will deteriorate and be pulled down. As an aside, Caputo would say, God is the call to deconstruct and reconstruct these gods, which is why the early followers of Jesus were called atheists. And we can become aware of this depth in which we live and move and have our being, this ground, this ocean, this God beyond God in multifarious and surprising ways. Through silence together, through beauty, language, architecture, flowers, beautiful cushions. This presence of another, a smile of a stranger, a kind word, a mischievous word even. There's a lot more going on here in our liturgy than all that I've just said. I'm only scratching the surface. But I'll end this reflection with a caution. All these words like awareness, depth, noticing, prayer, God, they're not an end point. Inner peace is not an end point. Realization is not an end point. Wisdom not an end point. The end point is the radical transformation of relationships by means of justice and grace that builds a vision of peace and well-being for all. What in memory of St. Andrew I would call befriending. The Gospel text today, John 6, has Andrew, our hero, befriending a child, a boy who wants to offer his 5 barley loaves and 2 fish to feed a multitude, which it does. For this is a story, a poem, theopoetics, about the impossible being confronted and converted by the possible. It's not about the supernatural, like a Jesus God wizarding out of thin air more and more bread and fishies. And it's not about the natural either, like the old liberal interpretation of this passage of people suddenly catching on to the idea of sharing and opening their baskets like the boy had opened his. No, this is a story. Maybe using the Elijah saga in 2 Kings for inspiration. On the one hand, this never happened. Like Jim, now James and Huck Finn never went in that raft down the Mississippi River evading the law. On the other hand, this always happens. Like brave characters and their braver authors, putting before us in ways we can hear the call for justice, the call to make possible what the most powerful want us to think is impossible. In James and Huck's case, acceptance, inclusivity, equity, the end of racial segregation in the Confederate South. No wonder Twain's book got banned. The Andrew part of today's gospel story is in verses 8 and verses 9. He's introduced as Simon Peter's brother. I bet that used to grate on him. He's Simon's brother. And then Andrew said to Jesus, there's a boy here who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. But, says Andrew, what are they among so many? So let's use that wonderful little tool, theological tool, called the imagination, and probe this a bit further. I'm assuming that Andrew liked disciples of Jesus. Like disciples not just of Jesus, but generally disciples in the first century. He was controlling access to the master. So the boy turns up and makes his pitch, his offer, firstly to Andrew. A ridiculous offer given the need. Totally inadequate to meet the problem of hunger. A problem that Philip, who's the accountant in the story, has done the maths on. But Andrew doesn't tell the boy to get lost, or laughs at him, or pinches his lunch. Instead, he recognizes the faith, what we might call the impulse of the boy. Maybe he recognizes that the impulse was similar to what got him, Andrew, out of a fishing boat and following an itinerant preacher all around the countryside. Who knows? So he befriends that impulse, and in so doing befriends the boy who had the courage to act on the impulse. Another way to frame this is that Andrew, like the boy, hears the call, that weak whisper that says, what is so needn't be so. The words that cast doubt on how food and its production and distribution are all managed and organized in a way that serves the powerful and starves others. Generation after generation. What is so needn't be so. That same call that inspired Mark Twain to rail against racial injustice and segregation. What is so needn't be so. God, says John Caputo, is the name of a call that calls for the coming of the impossible, for the possibility of the impossible, to which we should be the response. And the example he gives is what the New Testament communities, that is, those authors and groups of followers and editors, have done with the word kingdom. For the New Testament has threaded throughout this word kingdom, basileia, nowadays translated as empire, an overtly political word, so let's not get into that spiritual mumbo-jumbo. The word, certainly in my lifetime, has fallen on bad things, bad times, because it resounds with royalty and authoritarianism, power and patriarchy, even theocracy. But in the imagination of the early Jesus communities, it refers to a world that has reversed expectations, where offence is met with forgiveness. The first are last, the last first. The poor are privileged, and the rich have a very narrow needle to thread. And we are asked to love our enemies, all of which is pretty nigh impossible. All the expected effects of power, authority, and hierarchical rule are reversed, turned topsy-turvy, resulting in the rule of the unruly, the reign of the unroyal, a sacred anarchy, as Caputo says. The kingdom of the ill-born and powerless people, a kingdom of fools, looks mad to the rest of the world. This is a kingdom in an ironic sense that mocks authoritarianism and patriarchy, which I would add is the only sense that makes sense with the Jesus sensibility of that Sunday liturgically named Christ the King. In other words, our forebears, way back in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, in response to a call of and for justice, took various words and ideas like kingdom, like Messiah, and turned them on their head in order to deconstruct, destabilize the ideologies and institutions that use them, and then reconstruct a new order marked by egalitarianism, mutuality, and inclusivity. God was not a being, supreme or otherwise, who was going to do all this work for them. God was the name of the call. The response was theirs. Responsibility was theirs. Likewise, what is going on here Sunday by Sunday is listening for and affirming that impulse, that faith in each other, that call to and for justice, to pull down the mighty from their thrones, lift up the lowly, that call to be thought of as fools, call to imagine the possibility of the impossible, and then work together, dream together, plan together, to offer what we can, where we can, to whomever we can, to make it happen, for God's sake.